Which leads me to our second way to wreck your marriage. Write this down. Just assume that the issues in your marriage will work themselves out. This is a great way to wreck your marriage. Just assume that the issues in your marriage will work themselves out. Now, like you, I've known a lot of people in my life who've had their marriage fall apart or have gotten very, very close to divorce outside of a miracle of God. And I've spent some time, Charlene and I have spent some time just reflecting on all these situations we've seen and people we've known, and including our own marriage. And we've just tried to figure out, what can we learn from this? But the big lesson I think I've walked away with from looking at all these different marriages is this one truth. And I know it's a little bit wordy, but make a note of this and then we'll unpack it. Deeply rooted issues in a marriage almost never work themselves out. They must be confronted because time increases their power. They must be confronted because time increases their power. If you're a Christian, you should be familiar with the concept that shows up over and over again in Scripture, that the power of Satan, the power of sin, is strong in the darkness when things are in secret. And Jesus, on the opposite end of that, describes himself as light, and light that brings freedom and liberty, because as long as sin and shame are kept in the dark, they have power. When they're pulled into the light, they're robbed of their power. And we find freedom as well. Issues in marriage work the same way. The longer they stay hidden, the longer they stay on the shelf, the longer they get swept into the rug, the longer they stay in the shadows, the more powerful they become. Issues in a marriage don't go away with time. They only get stronger, and resentment gets deeper. Really absorb what those words mean that we made a note of. What I've noticed with pretty much 100% consistency is that when issues rise up in a marriage, they've usually been there for years, but here's the real kicker. And usually at least one person in the marriage was aware of the issues. They were aware of them. But either they didn't bring them up, or the other person didn't take them seriously. Most of the time, they didn't bring them up. They simply didn't bring them up because they thought the issue would work itself out. Maybe they misapplied grace and they said, no, I'm going to show grace here. But you're not really showing grace when you haven't actually let an issue go, right? So in other words, you can't lie to yourself and say, you know what, I'm just going to be gracious like Jesus and let this issue go, but continue to be bitter about it inside. You haven't actually let it go, and that's not actually, therefore, showing any kind of real grace. Or they didn't want to deal with the potential conflict. I don't want to be a troublemaker in the marriage. Or they kept convincing themselves that it wasn't really an issue. We had a couple of good days this week. And that's what happens with couples who have kids. You know, there's a serious issue beneath the surface, but there's always a way to dismiss it. Like the picture of the whole family at Disneyland. And we can just go, see, we're a happy family. You know, all in all things considered, we're doing well. And we come up with all these ways to avoid dealing with an issue that we know is lurking beneath the surface in our marriage. Most marriages fall apart because the issues only come out when they've been festering for years, and then there's too much hurt, there's too much bitterness, there's too much resentment that's built up. And so it comes out when someone can't stand it anymore, and they're at the breaking point, which tragically is the hardest place to actually deal with an issue. Because when it finally comes out, one person's already had enough. And that's the only reason it's coming out. Here's the truth, and you need to be honest about this with yourself and your marriage. Time is either healing the wounds in your marriage or it's further infecting them. And you better make sure that you know the difference. Time is either healing the wounds in your marriage because you've really let it go, there's really been forgiveness, it's really not still bothering you. Time is either bringing healing or it's infecting the wound even further. And most marriages fall apart because one or both spouses are lying to themselves about which of those two things is actually happening. Don't tell yourself you've let something go when you know deep down you're still bitter, angry, and hurting. You're not healing. The wound's just getting more infected over time. If there's an issue in your marriage that's a big deal to you, you must deal with it. You must deal with it. If you know that something is still going to bother you deeply in a couple of years, you better be honest with yourself and your spouse about that. Lying to yourself and to them is not being kind. It's sabotaging your marriage.